Hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. My name is Warwick Powell. Today I'm joined by Professor Liang, who is a professor of economics at Willamette University. Our subject matter is RMB, or Chinese yuan internationalization, and it was in a sense sparked by a story in The Economist magazine published about a month and a half ago, which talked about China's rush to de-dollarize. And it made me laugh because a year ago, The Economist was running stories about why this wasn't going to happen at all. What I wanted to do was unpack this question of RMB internationalization a little bit more, and I'm really pleased that Yen has been able to come back on the show to help us understand what's going on. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you, Warwick.
It's good to see you. And let's dive in. The issue of the RMB internationalizing has, of course, garnered a little bit more public attention again, not only on the back of the story in The Economist, but also more broadly with a number of events, I guess. One is there has been a little bit more talk in China about internationalization of the RMB. We have seen in recent months countries such as Hungary and even Russian energy corporations issue RMB denominated bonds. And in the last month, we have seen the launch of the International Center for the Digital Yuan in Shanghai. So all of this tells me that this is probably a good time to take stock of what digital RMB is, RMB internationalization, etc. What's your take on where things are at?
Well, yeah, I think this is really a fascinating topic. Many people don't really think too much about, the currency status in the current international financial architecture. In fact, this is really important, right? Because we do live in this dollar-centered world where, dollar accounts for 57% of the foreign exchange reserves. It's 88% of the global payments. The total add up to 200%, right? Because there's always a pair of currency that is in transaction. It also accounted for, oversized in terms of trade finance share when it comes to foreign exchange transactions and so on and so forth. So dollar has become this dominant currency, right? Countries trying to, save dollars for their exchange reserves. They're using dollar as a vehicle currency when they make international payments. They're using dollar for the trade invoicing. So this gives tremendous power to the dollar and the United States and the US financial corporations. So I think then that also subject all the dollar users in a very vulnerable position because whether or not they get dollar, right, it's really subject to the US's policy, volition. And so we have seen that the US has failed many times in really governing the dollar system, right, and make it really work for the rest of the world. So I think that is where I think China has decided very early on. I think really one of the sort of the revelation that we have seen was after the 2008 financial crisis, right? The then central banker Zhou Xiaochuan has pronounced that we have a very fragile financial system that is centered around the dollar, and we need to have a real international currency to reform, right, the current financial architecture. Now, China has been doing its own homework, right, which is to promote this idea of so-called internationalization of RMB. Now, many people think this is simply about de-dollarization. I think there are some common factors between these two, right? This idea that we wanted to dilute a little bit the weight and the power of the dollar in the international financial architecture. But these two are not exactly the same. Why? Because de-dollarization could mean now we're using more euros, right, instead of dollars. But that is not what China's purpose. China's purpose is, on the one hand, we want to diversify the uses of currencies, not over reliant on the US dollar. But at the same time, China wants to promote the uses of the RMB outside of its border and for its own cross-border transactions. So I think that is what the RMB internationalization is about. Now, when you talk about taking stock of RMB internationalization, I think in this case, right, I think economist has been wrong twice, right? I think you said a year ago, they dismissed the idea of internationalization. And now they're seeming to say China or the RMB is going to dethrone the dollar. I think both views are mistaken, right? That we know China has taken very tangible and effective measures to promote overseas of dollars, and especially in its own cross-border payments. We know now it's over 50% of China's own cross-border transactions are done in the RMB, right? And that is, a tremendous increase from the early 2010s. From a very negligible share, right? The yuan now is accounting for more than 50%, right? So I think that is important to note. But yet at the same time, when you look at the multi-currency world, right, the dollar is still dominant, right? I think when we look at the Chinese yuan, it is still only accounting for about 3.5% of global payment. It still only account for about 6% of the trade finance. It is still only account for about 2.18% of the foreign exchange reserve. So again, the number really are paled by the US's large share. But then we also have to see this is actually rapid growth from just 4 years ago, right? Back then, China's global payment share was only 2%. Now it's over 3.5%. Trade finance used to be 2%. Again, this is about 4 years ago, 2021. Now it's 6%. So it's a 3% increase, 3 times increase in the share. Same with when it comes to, international foreign exchange reserves. And by all these, what we're seeing is that, yes, China's share is still relatively small, but it has increased really, rapidly. And we also need to talk about, exactly what it counts as an international currency and what are the sort of qualifications to become an international sort of currency, right? And again, I think China has demonstrated that despite all these talks about, China is not capable of promoting RMB uses, we're actually seeing China is rapidly increasing the yuan uses in the global, financial system. But again, I think the idea of dethrone the dollar in the very short term, I think there are difficulties of doing that for all kinds of reasons. And it's not necessarily in the interest of China to disrupt the international financial system in a drastic way. But that said, I do think that the trend has been diversification, right? To have this multi-currency, multipolar world, even in that currency space.
One of the issues that's often raised about this question of RMB internationalization is the issue of capital controls and the lack of openness of the Chinese capital account. But there are views that would argue that that is not actually a necessary precondition for what is in effect a practical sense of RMB internationalization. Could you unpack that a little bit for us? I'm thinking, of course, of Barry Eichengreen's paper a couple of years ago, which said, look, China doesn't need to have an open capital account for RMB internationalization. So what's at stake in this sort of discussion?
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent question, right? So that is really the conventional system to say, China's RMB cannot be an international currency because there's too much government. And euro cannot be the international currency because there's not enough government in there, right? So dollar, being still in that dirty laundry basket, but it's the cleanest shirt out of all the dirty ones. And so somehow dollar is still, going to maintain its hegemonic position. I think, again, this is based on this conventional wisdom, right? To become a so-called hegemon currency or dominant currency or international currency, you need to have 4 elements. One is you need to have enough economic weight, which we know that China definitely meet that criteria, right? China's economy is 17% of the global, GDP, similar size of global trade, way more actually in terms of the trade share, not way more, but it's more than the US share. So China does have that economic weight. Second is that you need to have very well-developed financial markets. So you would have to have, financial assets that are denominated in your currency for sale for foreign investors. So they're willing to put their money in your currency and your currency denominated financial assets. So this is the one that arguably to say that China does not meet that criteria. China does not have a huge treasury markets that would allow investors to come in the country or purchase your yuan denominated treasuries in an unregulated manner, right? And third idea is that there should be confidence in your currency, meaning your currency should be a stable currency, right? The exchange rate is not going to fluctuate too much or is not going to erode over time. And I think China definitely meet that criteria. I think, as a matter of fact, many people believe that China's currency is too stable, right? Because again, the government intervenes to keep the currency stable. And then the last factor is this whole idea of network effect, right? Which is because I'm using dollar because I know you are using dollar, right? So there is this kind of path dependency. There is a network effect. So the longer people use dollar, the longer the dollar is going to stay dominant. So this whole idea of, there is not enough capital account mobility, and therefore yuan cannot be an international currency, I think it really focused on this idea that the yuan needs to be somehow facilitate or become a vehicle currency for financial investments. Now, first of all, you mentioned, Barry Eichengreen. So his debate is with Frankel, right, who was the sort of the original sort of architect about these four elements that would promote international uses of currency. So I think the debate here is really the idea that even though China has this capital account control, it does build infrastructure and facilities to allow foreign investors to invest in yuan-denominated assets. So we know that Chinese government has all kinds of schemes that is in place, right? The QFII, the Qualified for Foreign Institutional Investors, that started early 2010s, that allow foreign investors to invest in China's stock markets and other financial instruments. There's also all these bond connects that would allow, again, foreign investors to go through Hong Kong and then connect to Shanghai and connect to Shenzhen. There's also, these equity connectors that would allow, the bond connectors and stock connectors that would allow foreign investors to invest in China, but it will maintain a closed loop system, so to speak. So, for example, you're able to buy and sell, Chinese bonds or stocks, but you're not allowed to make that investment fungible, let's say, buy in the real estate or other sectors, so to speak, right? So there are all these mechanisms, there are all these infrastructure that are set up to allow foreign investors actually to invest in the yuan assets. So this idea that you don't necessarily need to have an open, unregulated environment to allow foreign investors to invest, I think Barry Eichengreen gets that right? So there's still a lot of venues to allow investors to invest, but in a relatively more regulated and orderly manner, right? So that's one thing I think it's clear. And his other argument is also that, as China gradually open up its capital account, right, you're going to see more and more opportunities like this. But of course, I think there is still a fundamental question, which is whether or not it is in China's interests to really promote RMB uses for financial speculation, right? Let's be out very frank, right? This is nothing about investing in real production or investing in real productive economy, right? We're talking about financial, quote unquote, investments, right? It is not in China's interest, I think, to follow the US's path, right? Which is to engineer, to produce a lot of these financial instruments, right? Be it, plain vanilla treasuries or some other agencies or some other collateral debt obligations or any other, fancier structured debt instruments for foreign investors to grab. But it doesn't mean, right, I think at the end of the day, that has to be part of the international uses of RMB, right? We could see how RMB can be used more for bilateral trade, for trade finance, for development finance, for foreign exchange reserves even. And we can talk about how China, facilitate all these swap lines with other countries. So there is incentive for foreign central banks, right, to accumulate Chinese yuan. So I think there is a separation here in terms of the functionalities of the Chinese yuan, not to use it for speculative purposes, right? But to use it to finance real production, real trade, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that institutional design issue that links finance capital, if you will, with the development of fixed capital assets seems to me to be one of the defining features of RMB internationalization with Chinese characteristics. And I can think of three elements, if I can just draw on what you've said, which hopefully then will help us dive into them in a little bit more. One is the issue of the equities markets and how exchange to exchange institutional relationships and regulated products development creates dual listed equities, if you will, that facilitate that part of the jigsaw puzzle. The second part is the Chinese bonds market itself, but also in particular the ability of non-Chinese actors and to issue RMB denominated bond instruments. And the third one actually goes to the question of the RMB itself. And you've touched on the swap lines, and the RMB, of course, is not a freely traded currency per se, with very significant People's Bank of China involvement in managing the relative values, within a band. So perhaps we can just unpack those three elements a little bit in any particular sequence that you want. But I guess for the audience, just to think about this, we've used some sort of technical terms, if you will, current accounts and capital accounts. But in a very fundamental sense, when somebody has RMB, the big question, of course, is what do you do with it? And you either hold it as RMB or you have to do something else. And the question we're touching on is what else can someone do with it? So trading currencies themselves or dealing with the currency part, the equities part, and the bonds part. Over to you again.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, there's a question of how. So your question starts with, if the countries have the Chinese yuan, what can they do about it, right? So yes, they could. Again, depends on whether that yuan is in the official accounts, right, as a foreign exchange reserves for the government, or it's in the private hands, right? So private investors, they could use the yuan to buy equity, right, in the stock market in China or in the bonds, right, again, through those connectors, right? So that's, they can also use the yuan to pay for Chinese imports or Chinese exports, their imports from China, right? So those are the ways where you are able to use the currency to either acquire financial instruments, right, or you can use it for real goods and services, or you can use it as a reserve assets. So those are the three ways that you're able to, use that, right? So there's no impediments or anything, right? If you are doing imports using yuan to pay for your imports, there's no impediment where you can accumulate the yuan as your official reserve assets. There are some regulations, of course, on the equity and bond acquisitions. But again, if you comply, right, with China's regulations, you're able to do so. I think there's the other question, the flip side of that is how do we acquire yuan? I think that is more of, I think many people are scratching their head and said, China is a main trade surplus country. So how do other countries acquire the Chinese yuan, right? And so that I think is the question. And again, I think there is a very interesting article in the recent Financial Times, which basically says, why do I stop worrying about China's so-called overcapacity, right? So this idea that China is so formidable, is generating all these trade surpluses, it exports more than it imports, and would the rest of the world be flooded with the Chinese goods, right? And so the author simply says, well, with all these green products, green technologies, there's no limited demand for them right now, right? When you think about solar panels, when you think about wind turbines, as long as the world needs energy, I don't see how these products can be so-called oversupplied, right? But then on the financial side, right, there is a question about how does the world get the Chinese yuan if they do want to use the yuan to buy Chinese equity? They want to use the yuan to buy the Chinese imports. They want to use the yuan to save as official reserve assets. But how do they acquire yuan? So how does China recycle, so to speak, right? It's yuan so that the rest of the world can get hold of them. So this is where, first of all, the panda bond that you mentioned earlier, right? This is basically foreign entities are issuing RMB denominated bonds to sell on the Chinese onshore market to get RMB financing. And you mentioned Hungary, that had, I think, recent in July, 5 billion yuan of panda bond issuance. There are many others. As a matter of fact, the total cumulative issuance by mid this year is RMB 1 trillion yuan. That's the amount of panda bond that has been issued. And in terms of entity that issued, there are ADB, IFC, the Internationalization Corporation. Those were the first ones back in 2005. They issued the panda bonds. Morgan Stanley, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, African Export-Import Development Bank, and other private entities have issued, panda bonds. So this is one way, right, for these investors or governments to be able to get, the RMB financing through the panda bonds. And I think that is, again, there are a lot of interesting research that shows there has been willingness both from China and also the rest of the world to continue to issue more panda bonds for development finance purposes. So that's one way, right, for the rest of the world to get the RMB funding. The second, of course, is China also increased now RMB share in its BRI lending, right? I think these days we don't talk enough about BRI initiative anymore for all kinds of reasons. But as a matter of fact, China has been increasing the share of the RMB in its overseas BRI lending. It used to be less than 10%, right, when BRI started. But now the number has gone up. And I think the most recent data, I'm a little bit vague on the numbers, but it's much, much higher than that 10%. It's somewhere between 40, 50% or more. The ODI has a specific share if anyone is interested. So that's another way that China is lending and allowing bond issuance, right, to get the finance in the RMB. And then there is a swap line that China's central bank has set up with over 40 countries, right, with over $400 billion worth of the swap agreements. So when countries have difficulties, say Argentina, for example, they're able to use the swap line and get the yuan and pay actually for IMF loans. So I think that is another very interesting development right there. So as long as China is able to recycle, right, its yuan, allow the rest of the world to acquire it, and then the rest of the world will be able to find the channels to utilize the yuan, then that could create a good, loop, right, that creates the cycle of, yuan liquidity and then yuan uses.
It seems that these liquidity circuits are quite particular in that they are very much designed in a way that connects up the flow of the currency with some real economic activity, right? So it's far less about a flow of money in stock exchanges for the sake of it. It really seems to be very anchored to tangible, concrete things. Is that one of the characteristics of RMB internationalization with Chinese characteristics that's different from US dollar internationalization historically?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if you look at, the dollar's role in really financing trade or to provide development finance, it's not as much as its share in the foreign exchange transactions. So a lot of the foreign exchange transactions, as you are aware of, is that those are not really used to support any real economic activities, right? I mean, the number is striking. You have tens of trillions of daily turnover in the foreign exchange markets, whereas, the trade, annual trade is only tens of, trillions of dollars, right? Global GDP, same thing. So there's a lot of foreign exchange transactions that are using dollar that is not really to support any real economic activities, be it producing GDP or to facilitate trade. So a lot of it is for speculation, right? Some is for currency speculation. Some is for, again, stock market or bond market speculation. So I do think that China's most interest right now is to promote RMB uses, to provide, trade financing, to provide payment system for real goods and services, and to also use it for safeguard your financial order. And I think, again, China has been doing a lot in terms of development financing in the past decades. And there's a lot of research that shows China's development financing really enhance countries' growth prospect compared to what World Bank does, right? World Bank does not have this, does not have the evidence to suggest World Bank loans actually contribute to economic growth in these recipient countries. Whereas China's BRI financing, right, is statistically significant in promoting growth in the recipient countries. And one of the most recent, actually, what just transpired recently is also Kenya, right, that has swapped out its dollar loan from China with now RMB denominated loans. Why? Because the RMB financing is so much cheaper, and the dollar, and so the yuan has been stable in value. So Kenya still owes China about $3.5 billion with the SDG, the standard gauge weight real weight loans. So they are now swapping the loans, from dollar denominated to yuan denominated, and that will save them over $215 million of debt servicing cost. So that's another way to see, how China's yuan financing is being cost effective, and it's also meeting the needs of countries because it's difficult to get affordable, dollar financing these days, right? I mean, there are people who quibble about, oh, China's loan, carry a too high interest. Well, I mean, if you look at the numbers, right, the Chinese loan to Kenya to build this railway is at an average cost about 6% of interest, right? It's a floating rate, but there's part of it also concessionary. Without getting too much into details, let's just say, overall, it's about 6% rate. Compared to the Euro bonds that Kenya issued for the same kind of tenor, it's 9% or above. So I think to say that, China's finance, right, it's not affordable, or China does not provide enough, or China's finance is not productive, right? I think none of this is borne out by the evidence, right? So that's just a way to see, China financing has been productive and useful, right, for the recipient countries. And as China promoting more yuan denominated currency loans, I think that also benefits countries. For one, it's cheaper. For two, RMB is stable. For three, China, as I mentioned, has a swap line with over 40 central banks. The United States have 5. And all of those are OECD advanced economies, right? There's no others except for a short period during the pandemic. The US Fed had 14 swap lines, including 2 emerging markets, Brazil and Mexico. But that has gone, right? So the fact that China is willing to give out RMB denominated loans and then provide the liquidity backup, I think that just says a lot, right, about how China is reliable, right, financing sources in this regard.
So we've touched on institutions, policy, and products in a sense. The last thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is the digital RMB and what's going on in that space, because the ongoing evolution of China's own policy and strategic approach to currencies obviously involves this question of the ERMB. It's a global leader in the research around the CBDC, and it's just launched this International Centre for the Digital RMB in Shanghai. Where are things at with the digital RMB? And what are the main features and issues that are being addressed through this international centre?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think the way that China is promoting the RMB uses is very much tied to the CBDC project, right? Because the technological solution, right, to promoting RMB, I think rests on the CBDC, right? Again, we can make a comparison with the United States crypto, private crypto, speculative assets land, right? And China is not doing that. China understands if you really want to develop a digital currency, it has to be centralized in terms of the regulations, in terms of the liquidity backstop, right? Not in terms of the distributed ledger, in terms of that decentralized system. So that is clear to make a distinction. So I think the way that China sees this, right, both is because when you have a central bank digital currency, it really improves the efficiency. It really allows you to use, the digital, the crypto, the blockchain technology to build infrastructure, right, for both domestic circulation, but also for overseas uses. And second is, as you are aware of, the BIS has teamed up with China, Hong Kong, and other two countries had run this Enbridge project, right, which is basically using the CBDC and distributed ledger to create this cross-border infrastructure. And it has already achieved the minimum market viability, right? So that just shows that the CBDC is the way to build a cross-border payment system, unlike the current, the correspondent bank approach, which still use the dollar as a vehicle currency, still use mostly Western headquarter financial mega banks, right, as the respondent banks. So I think that's the approach that China is taken, and many other countries are doing pretty much the same thing, right? And so they see the both in terms of the security, in terms of efficiency, in terms of sovereignty, the central bank digital currency is the way to go, right? The crypto private assets don't meet the tests of singleness, elasticity, and integrity to be a real currency. So that's why you need to have the central government, central bank, right, to develop the cryptocurrency and to use the infrastructure to do that. So you talked about the most recent development in China is the recent Lujiazui forum, where China pronounced, right, that it's going to establish this CBDC clearing center in Shanghai, right? So this is basically to allow, digital currency, right, the RMB, to be settled in Shanghai using, their blockchain technologies, using their hard infrastructure, right? There will be data center, there will be research center, and because Shanghai is such a financial center in China, a lot of the transactions, a lot of contracts, right, are signed there. A large payments are, not physically done in Shanghai, but it goes through Shanghai, right, as a hub. So that makes sense for Shanghai to be the sort of the center, right, for this digital currency transaction and clearing center. So I think that is, again, to accelerate, right, to build up this infrastructure to allow digital currency and allow for cross-border payment in this digital currency, using, again, essential platforms with open access to, both Chinese banks and financial institutions, but also overseas and offshore, financial institutions.
So, in a sense, the technology development is being done so as to enhance speed, security, and reduce costs, but within the context of the institutional and policy and product developments that we've already touched on. So, it's really a means to an end as far as making it easier, safer, quicker, cheaper to use the RMB for different things. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. I think that is a good summary of China's current efforts. And again, I think it's secure, it is also cost effective, and it's importantly overcoming or circumventing, right, the dollar as a vehicle currency and the Western mega banks as respondent banks. Because again, this could mean a lot of vulnerability, because if a Chinese businessman wants to, or business person wants to make a transaction, want to make a payment, right, to somebody overseas, even if it's a neighbor country, let's say a Thai business person, right, this transaction first needs to be converted the yuan into dollar, then dollar to pound, Thai baht, and it has to go through maybe New York-based, respondent banks, and therefore is subject to New York State's financial regulations and legal system. So that is very easily, exposed to any sort of legal disputes or weaponization, right? Cut off the access to these kinds of, payment systems. So that's why I think really is essential to think about this not just as economic problems, right, but also as a security, and geopolitical and so on and so forth, right? This is a very essential issue, that I think both China and many other countries, Russia, India, Brazil these days, as we know, the BRICS are also working very hard to build their cross-border payment initiative, for the precisely the same similar reasons.
Look, there's one last question that I want to ask you, which in a sense extends from the question of RMB internationalization, and you've just touched on it, which is what is going on in BRICS. And I noticed in the last few days that India and Russia look like they're going to be transacting oil in RMB again. But there is this broader question of where BRICS is likely to head over the next few years as far as resolving its own approaches to this national currency-based settlement method and system, institutions and technologies. What's the latest news on that based on what you know?
Right. So I think a lot of active efforts are at the bilateral level within the BRICS members, right? So you talk about India and Russia, Russia and China, UAE with India, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of efforts at the bilateral level to try to make the payment system more interoperable. So they're going to be connected. For example, the India has the UPI system, which is their national payment system, and Russia has its own, the Mirror card, which is a national payment card, and you have Brazil also have their PIX, right? So one of the, I think the breakthroughs right now, or the most efforts are visible efforts are to make these national payment systems compatible with each other, or speak to each other, or connect to each other. So I think that has made a lot of progress on that front. Now, collectively, I think BRICS are still, in a way, try out different possibilities, right? As you remember early on, there has been the idea of a BRICS currency, right? Now, we know that is pretty much a dead end. It's not the most effective way to handle cross-border payments, and there are also a lot of questions about fiscal and monetary autonomy when you have a common currency, even if this is only for external uses. And then there's also the question about, do we want to have a clearing unit, which is not a currency, but some kind of bookkeeping unit of account only to take care of the intra-BRICS transactions, right? To have one sort of BRICS clearing unit. Right now, I think from what I understand, again, from the 2024, when Russia was chairing the BRICS-man research group on this cross-border payment system research, it seems to me that their most recent, sort of the iteration is to think about having a common payment platform using multiple local currencies for their clearings. So in other words, forget about a BRICS currency, forget a clearing unit. We're all going to use our own local currencies, but we're going to have a blockchain currency, and utilize a distributed ledger. So then we'll be able to have this common platform to do the clearing, to make the cross-border payments, right? And in this Russian report, they specifically mention, again, a BIS-led initiative. It's called the Project Donbar, which is basically, 4 central banks, they come together and they develop this protocols, products, and 2 different the 2 different prototypes as a centralized platform that use distributed ledger using these different currencies in a digital form, of course, and use that as a way to clear payments among each other, right? So again, the research report specifically mentioned this project, right? So it seems to me that the collective direction here, at least proposed by Russia, and seem to be endorsed by the BRICS countries, is to continue to build the CBDCs and then use a centralized platform with distributed ledger, with the blockchain technology, to have the payment system set up that way. And to me, this makes a lot of sense, right? Again, technologically, this seems to be viable. The BIS and these central banks have already test run it. They have built two platforms that seem to be working well. And they also have invited many observers, seem to be, again, pretty positive about the outcomes. And, I think it's also practical, right, in the sense of it doesn't require a lot more other, sort of efforts. And there's also, I think, the political will, and there is the real sort of urgency, right, for these countries to build a common payment system that bypass the dollar-centric system. So hopefully we'll see more development on that front. But it's clear that, from the inception, BRICS has talked about their core mission is to establish an alternative financial order, right? The International Monetary and Financial System, IMFS, to provide some kind of counterweight and optionalities compared to the current system. So I think that is really ingrained in their missions, in their efforts. So hopefully we'll see more breakthroughs on that front.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory in this talk, and I guess we started with RMB internationalization, touched on questions of what that really meant from a de-dollarization point of view, and ultimately landed at currency multipolarity through BRICS. Thanks again, Professor Liang, for joining me to update us on what's going on in the world of global financial architecture, which, whilst many of us take for granted, is actually fundamental to how the world of economic value flows work. Look forward to having you back on again in the not too distant future. Thanks for your time and your insights.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and good to talk to you as always.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.